what kind of relationship they have now. So Birte, if you want to first take the floor on that historical relationship and bound and probably or maybe competition that there has been between the two organizations.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm very grateful you to invite me for this conference, one of my favorite subjects of study. I did my habilitation thesis on the Council of Europe. And before we wrote the book with Friederike on the relationship between the two organizations, I had actually regarded these organizations more from a historical point of view, because my specialty was the history of the Council of Europe. And you cannot write the history of the Council of Europe without taking into account the history of the European Union, of the European community. And in fact, I originally defined 3 periods of relationships between the two organizations. And from the start, it was very difficult because the first period was kind of from 1949 until the first enlargement of the European community to the United Kingdom. And this was a period when, in fact, the two organizations represented 2 different ways of how to construct Europe. The Council of Europe was always the more intergovernmentalist way of seeing European integration, meaning that you work together, you do European conventions. Most important one, of course, the Council is the Convention of Human Rights, but there are a lot of other conventions. You work in a lot of fields of competence, education, culture, even economic cooperation, but you do it in an intergovernmental way, meaning that you do not give up sovereignty. The only maybe notable exception is the Court of Human Rights, because there is a kind of recognition, but Frederick can say more about this, regarding the Court of the Supreme Authority for Human Rights Protection. So this is an exception, but apart from that exception, all the work in the Council of Europe is being done in an intergovernmental way, meaning you need unanimity. And you also need, there is no, it's international law. You cannot directly apply any of the conventions in the member states of the Council of Europe. I also always said that the Council of Europe was a vision of a large Europe, because if you look at it today, you have 47 member states. It's a Europe which is regarded in the most broadest sense, both geographically and maybe also politically, because when you look at it today, you have both Russia and Turkey in the Council of Europe. It's a very large organization, whereas the European community is always smaller in terms of members. But from the start, it was difficult. Why? Because when they first set up the Council of Europe in 1949, and the approach was there was a kind of competition between the federalist approach to Europe, which was the French and the Italian, the Belgian way to see Europe, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman. And then there was the intergovernmental way of regarding Europe, represented by Winston Churchill, who was kind of one of the fathers of creation of for the Council of Europe. And this competition, you could see it in the setting up of the Council of Europe, because we have the Committee of Ministers, which is the intergovernmental view, but you also have a parliamentary assembly. The first assembly was set up by the Council of Europe. So you had this opposition of the two views, and those who were federalists believed that the parliamentary assembly, the assembly of the Council of Europe, would use the opportunity of this first organization in Strasbourg, which represented the ideal of European integration, would use it to transform the Council of Europe into a federation. And the heart of the federation was the parliament, the parliamentary assembly. But in 1951, they did not succeed to do so. This was the big failure right at the beginning of the Council of Europe. They wanted to organize a big conference where they transformed the Council of Europe into a federation. They did not succeed. And so as a reaction, in parallel, there was the Schuman Declaration and the idea to set up another European organization, which was the Coal and Steel Community, which had a more federalist objective, and which was the kind of beginning of the process of the European community. So you can see there was a contradiction right from the start between the two organizations. And this meant that the small Europe, the Coal and Steel Community and European community, they were, in fact, they did not like the Council of Europe. They didn't want the Council of Europe to be involved into the European community, because they thought that the British would then avoid, as in the Council of Europe, a federalist or supranational organization of the European community. So they wanted to stay apart. And you can see that in the archives. I had a PhD student. She investigated this. And there is a small annex to, when the coal and steel community was created, which kind of rules the relationship between the two organizations. But it is nothing. They just say, okay, we will exchange opinions, and that's all. Because the 6 founding member states of the European Community, they did not want the Council of Europe to intervene into the European Community. And the competition you can see, because the coal and steel community, they also set up a parliament, which will become the European Parliament. So you had 2 assemblies. And the interesting thing is that in the beginning, until the European Parliament was elected directly in 1979, the members of the parliaments, they were the same people. So they're sitting in Strasbourg in the former Council of Europe, the French parliamentarians, for example, and then they were sitting in the coal and steel community, the same people, but it was for 2 different organizations. And so, of course, there was a kind of personal union in the 2 assemblies, but the organizations were quite apart. But it was kind of complementary, because coal and steel was not a competition for the Council of Europe. They were working for education, culture, etc. And this changed in 1970. There was also in the first efforts to kind of have some on the Secretary General and the President of the Commission when the Commission was created. There were exchanges of views. They met on an informal basis, and they exchanged on how they could cooperate. So there was some form of cooperation. It was not very formalized. But all this complementarity changed in 1972 when the United Kingdom joined the European Community. Why? Because then you had the complementarity was that the British, okay, with their intergovernmental view, and the Scandinavians, they were working in the Council of Europe, and the Franco-German couple with the Benelux states, Italy, they were working in the Federalist Front. And this changed when the United Kingdom joined the European Community. You could no longer see really the difference between the 2 organizations. And also from that moment onwards, the European Community was in a view of enlarging. So they wanted to have more members, but they also wanted to have more competences. It was a starting point for the European Community to get involved in different areas of cooperation, which were areas that were not only economic. There was the common market, but progressively they also wanted to work in the field of culture, education. And so then the competition started, and it became more and more difficult. And the problem for the Council of Europe was, with their intergovernmental tools, they were not able to kind of compete properly with the European Community. Each time the European Community did something concretely, then the Council of Europe, they would be recognized for that more than the Council of Europe, because they had the European law, the legal tools to implement it much better than the Council of Europe had. And so there are some examples of it. For example, mutual recognition of diplomas that was initiated in the Council of Europe, but it was in fact later on the European Community, which with all the Erasmus and all the educational part, set this into practice. So the Council of Europe suffered from this. And it took until 1987 for the 2 organizations to have then a first formal agreement, not to a kind of division of work, that the European Community was more for economic cooperation in the Council of Europe, more for education, culture, etc. But this did not work very well. It did not function well. The only time when there was a really complementarity which worked well was from 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to 2005, when the European Union was enlarged to the Eastern and Central European states. Because during that time, that's a big period, during that time, there was a clear division of work. Council of Europe is the large Europe. They can integrate all Central and Eastern Europe, even some ex-Soviet republics. And that was necessary at the time, because these countries were new democracies. They wanted to work for the European construction. So this was fine for the European Union. The European Union could not take them in directly, because they needed to to develop their economies more. It took 10 years for them to enlarge to Eastern Europe. So Jacques Delors in 1989, he actually came to the Council of Europe and he said, look, we have a clear division of work. You take on all the Eastern European countries and we want to integrate, we want to become a federation, we want to create, that was the time, 1992, the Treaty of Maastricht, when they created the European Union. But when the European Union enlarged to Eastern and Central Europe, this time of complementarity was over again. And that was then again a difficult time. And I will finish because I don't want it to be too long, it's not a lecture. But in 2008, that was the very important, this is when we started really with Frédéric to look more into the recent development of relations between the Council of European Union. And I let her maybe explain how this worked out more in detail. But there was this memorandum of understanding which Jean-Claude Juncker initiated in the Council of Europe, which was then adopted in 2008. It was integrated into the Treaty of Lisbon in the European Union. And in this memorandum of understanding, you have a clear threefold cooperation structure for the two organizations: political cooperation, legal cooperation, and cooperation programs. I think Frédéric can say a lot more about these three sections of cooperation, and this is the strategy behind. This is from that moment onwards, the two organizations realized they would better have a strategy to see how they work together. And I think they have actually managed to, especially with the programs of cooperation, which function in the way that the European Union gives money to the Council of Europe, and the Council of Europe manages these cooperation programs, which are very much destined to the member states that are not members of the European Union. And it works really well, it's efficient, and it is in the interest of both organizations. Where they have failed is more in the, or maybe not, Frédéric will, I just give a lot of possibilities for Frédéric to then carry on, is the idea of a legal cooperation for the Court of Human Rights, where there was the idea, of course, of this accession of the European Union to the Convention, and this in the end failed because of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And I always thought personally that it was a big failure, but Frédéric, who is the specialist, the legal specialist, she convinced me in the end that maybe you do not really need an accession of the European Union to the Convention or to the Court. But this is a debate which is still ongoing. It's not. It's a question which is not solved yet. So this is still a dossier where the two organizations have to kind of find a compromise or a solution for their cooperation, because there is some competition in terms of human rights protection. But for the other parts, the political part and the, let's say, field cooperation, I think they have succeeded in sorting out their complementarity really well. And this is even better today when the United Kingdom has left the European Union. So maybe, this is because historically, for me, the competition started when they joined the European community. So maybe now they have left the European Union. There is even a better chance of trying to see how to sort out I'm not saying that the United Kingdom is the crucial actor in the Council of Europe, but it is a very important state in Europe. And they are certainly looking now to invest more into the Council of Europe now that they have left the European Union. Sorry for me to have been a bit long. This is the problem when you're specialist of a field.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Birte. And you actually made a perfect transition, because the one question I had next for Frédéric is precisely, because I saw you were also taking some notes, so I assume you would also have some things to share with us about the complementarity or the competition between the two organizations. But in your answer, if you could maybe for us briefly re-explain from your point of view what happened in the years 2010s when, as Birte was mentioning it, there was this project of having the EU joining the convention when it comes to human rights, and then it failed. And then it's also like not the first time that we hear that maybe it's not so bad that it actually failed. So I'm very interested in having your perspective both on the process itself and how it can now develop, or what it actually means for the further developments when it comes to cooperations and complementarity on the human rights perspective?
I will try to answer your question, even if it's not a very easy one. It always appears a bit weird that there is a competition between the Council of Europe and the European Union, because they have the same values and they defend the same project, which is a project of more cooperation in Europe. But it's very different project, and Birte said briefly in her presentation, it is different because the Council of Europe is a matter of cooperation between states. So I would say it's a classical international organization in which states have quite a lot of power. The European Union is an integration organization, and it means that the type of norms produced by the European Union are quite different from the one from the Council of Europe. Up to a certain point, it's more efficient because the member states lose their veto power or their power to control the application of the norms decided at the European level. And I think that between both institutions, both organizations, it's something which is still important. We discussed, for example, yesterday, the protection against child abuses. There's the very important Lanzarote Convention, which has been developed by the Council of Europe, and some members of the conference were asking, but would it be maybe more efficient to have an EU regulation concerning, for example, the question of the prescription of this kind of actions? And we had quite a heavy news in France since in January on this kind of subject. But it always appears to people that if the European Union intervene, it's much more efficient. We can criticize also this approach, but I think it's important maybe to understand that it's in fact they are very near the Council of Europe and the European Union, but they are very different. And in this long negotiation, because it's a very long negotiation of accession of the European Union to the European Convention, if we go back to the very beginning of the negotiation, it was in the 1970s that this idea first appeared. At the beginning, it was impossible for the European Union for a question of lack of competence. And in the Treaty of Lisbon, after quite some time, the member states decided to give to the European Union the competence to access to the Human Rights Convention. And that's why just after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, the negotiation really began with the Council of Europe. And the idea was quite simple. As the Council of Europe is the standard of protection of human rights in Europe because of the case law of the court, but also because of, I would say, special know-how on human rights. The idea was simply to guarantee the same level of protection into the European Union. So it seems to be quite logical to have this kind of debate. Why was it so difficult? Because it's difficult from the point of view of the Court of Justice of the European Union, because the Court of Justice is in charge of the protection of the division of competences between the European Union and the member states. And it's quite easy to understand that the question of division of competences between EU and the member states is I always say it is the cœur du contrat de mariage. That's very important, of course, for the member states of the European Union to respect this division. And we know that the Lisbon Treaty was quite a hard battle over this kind of problem. So, of course, the Court of Justice is defending its own autonomy in the game. And that's why at the end of the day, it was more the court than anyone else, which blocked the procedure with an opinion which was given in December, late December, so that we had Christmas to think about it. Late December 2014, which was a negative opinion on the project of a treaty of accession. Why do I say that it's not necessary? It's because, in fact, we see that you have an informal legal cooperation between both courts, because you have many dialogues between judges. But, for example, the Court of Justice is using the case law of the Court of Human Rights. So we do not have a real problem of differences of standards. But it is still a problem if for example, for an individual before the European Court of Human Rights, in case the member states defend its position saying it's not my responsibility, it's the responsibility of the European Union, then you can have a lack of protection of human rights. And I think that's why the negotiations have been reinitiated since 1 year. And apparently the Council of Europe decided about its new strategic framework program at the end of May. And one of the priority is this accession of the European Union to the European Court of Justice. It's not just a symbolic problem, because if we have this accession, I think that the legal affairs before the Court of Human Rights will change a little bit, because it's a much more economical affairs that they will have to treat, and maybe that's also something which is not entirely foreseen by the Court of Human Rights. But we'll see. Apparently, the political will is there. So I guess that if you have the political will, at the end of the day, you find out how to do it from a legal point of view. But I think that what is important is that you have a permanent cooperation between the European Union and the Council of Europe, apart from this specific problem. First of all, I think that we always have to consider that a lot of ideas developed by the European Union is coming from the Council of Europe. It was, for example, the case on the personal data protection, which was initiated in the framework of the Council of Europe by a convention, which is called the 108 Convention. And then it was developed with the EU legal instruments, first in a directive in 1995, and the famous general regulation on the data protection that we all practice since 2018. It is more or less the same ideas which have been developed based on the consent of person for the exploitation of personal data. But we see the differences is that the general regulation is much more powerful than the 108 Convention. But it's not always the same kind of relationship. If you take, for example, the Istanbul Convention, we had a lot of discussion on this Istanbul Convention concerning the protection of women against violences because of the Turkish position in the last weeks. This convention has been signed by the European Union. And it was a strong political will of the European Union to show that it is bound by these standards. It's not always very easy for the European Union, because if you take this convention, it's quite difficult to be sure about what are the real competences of the European Union on this specific problem. So the ratification process is quite complicated. But I think it is also a sign that the European Union want to be bound by general European standards.
And I think it's very important nowadays because after the COVID crisis, we have quite a new situation between both institutions, both organizations. The idea of the Council of Europe is to develop a sort of benchmarking approach on what is democracy in times of crisis, what kind of standards should be really respected in all the member states of the Council of Europe. And as Birte told us just before, it's important because we are 27 in the European Union and we are 47 in the Council of Europe. Of course, it's also a problem for the Council of Europe because 27 member states is quite a strong majority within the Council of Europe. So that's why also the relationships can be a little bit more difficult in sometimes because, of course, the European Union has a strong influence within the Council of Europe system. But I think that there is a sort of rééquilibrage between both institutions, and the COVID crisis is maybe quite a good news for these relationships. The ambition of the Council of Europe is also to develop legal cooperation. I think it's very important on two specific fields, the regulation of our artificial intelligence. The Council of Europe is playing quite an important role in the global reflection on this subject, and the European Union has developed also a certain number of rights and principles of regulations based on the work of the Council of Europe. And the second field, which should be of the utmost importance in the next few years, is environmental protection. We all know that within the European Union, we have the Green Deal with a lot of consequences in terms of directives, regulations, strategies, and so on and so forth. And the Council of Europe want to develop a specific protection for environment, because the level of protection which is developed on the basis of the European Convention of Human Rights is not enough. It's not efficient enough. So they want to progress into this field, and I think that it's important for the complementary approach of both organizations. This is also linked to something that is not always well known, but is very important for the Council of Europe. It is the budget of the Council of Europe. The European Union is one of the major contributors to the Council of Europe, and I think it's important because we have seen with Russia and up to a certain point with Turkey a certain number of tensions on this budgetary question, and the idea is that the European Union want to maintain and develop this finances of what we call joint agreements or joint cooperation in not only in Europe but around Europe also, to develop especially protection of human rights, protection of the rule of law, which is very problematic even between the member states of the European Union, and democracy, of course, which is a very important subject. So I think it's also important that we have these financial relationships, even if it's not always easy for the Council of Europe, because as it is for the European Union to pay, then it is for the European Union also to influence a certain number of decisions. So I think that's why we have this sort of permanent discussions between both institutions.
Okay, thank you very much for this really interesting answer. Maybe I can ask you two one last question before we give the floor to our participants, because we discussed how it started, and of course I couldn't not notice that you emphasized both how the structure of the European Union itself, and I mean the original aim, I would say, of integration and how this is originally what makes it so different from the Council of Europe, which is meant to be intergovernmental from the start, and having in mind, the fact that maybe Europe or the European Union, so like I shouldn't say Europe when we talk about Council of Europe and European Union, maybe the European Union has lost its track when it comes to integration. And in the context of the Conference of Europe, where of course this subject is back on the table, I would dare to say, especially for an organization like ours, I would like to have you both to have your opinion on, from like strategic point of view between the Council of Europe and the European Union. Do you think that there would be an added value for the European Union to sort of be back to like do integration and have a more like integrated space where like things that are being discussed are highly political, and have the Council of Europe doing other topics that it has developed expertise in, such as human rights, as you mentioned? Or would it be, or the way it works now is just fine, then they can still go on with this type of partnership? Do you see any overlapping that could be avoided in one case or another? So that would be my question to you both. Birte, maybe you want to take the floor first, sorry, and then I'll give it back to Frédéric.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Everything okay? Yeah. So I think both organizations have important challenges to face without looking at cooperation first, or there are challenges for both organizations. The European Union certainly has a challenge to progress on the way of integration, meaning integration in terms of new competences. We have seen that during the COVID crisis in terms of how borders are managed, for example, in terms of health policy. There are certainly, there is a need for further integration. The problem that the European Union has is that there are member states, mainly the Visegrad member states, who are not very favorable towards further supranational integration. So there might be the need to move to a different form of integration, which we can call sometimes the form of concentric circles, meaning that you start with a willing number of member states, maybe around the Franco-German couple, to progress on certain issues, and then other states will follow. We had this kind of integration already when you look at, for example, the Schengen Agreement, which was done outside the European Community, but it worked in a way like this. There were 5 member states started it, and then it was integrated later on into the Amsterdam Treaty, involving then all the members. So it's a kind of a pull factor. It's a different way how to envisage the integration. I think there's certainly a need in the European Union for more integration. We can also look at defense issues, the defense policy, security issues. There's still a lot of need to progress also in that field. And the European Commission has announced that they want to do this in the term of Ursula von der Leyen. So without looking at the Council of Europe, there is need to progress there. The Council of Europe is facing a different challenge. I mean, there's still the problem of Belarus and Kosovo. These are the 2 European states. They are not yet integrated. So maybe if the Kosovo once is recognized by everybody, then they can join. And if Belarus is no longer a dictatorship, they can join. But there's not a lot of work to do. There's 2 member states missing to cover the whole of Europe. But there is a problem that the Council of Europe has to face with the 47 member states in order to how to deal with member states who kind of fall a little bit out of the club of democracy and human rights protection. This is not new. It has happened before. I mean, not everybody is a good pupil in the Council of Europe, and it's not always the same bad guys like Russia, Turkey. Sometimes you can also find reports of the Commission of Human Rights blaming countries like Germany or France for not respecting certain conditions in prisons, for example. So respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law is always work in progress. And the Council of Europe has developed monitoring tools to make sure that they continuously look whether there is really respect for these values. But the challenge they are facing, and you can see this with the behavior, not only with Russia, but also, for example, United Kingdom, who are challenging, for example, some of the rulings of the court and say, we don't agree with the ruling of the court. We're not going to implement this. So if this happens, or they sign and ratify a convention, but they don't really respect it, or they no longer respect the rule of law. The Venice Commission has condemned the constitutional reforms in Poland, also in Hungary, but the Hungarian and the Polish state don't react. And the European Union, they are thinking also of applying sanctions and using to make Poland and Hungary, who are their member states, change. But for the moment, I mean, the Council of Europe has no way to impose sanctions and to make sure that these member states respect the rule of law. They have suspended Russia from the Parliamentary Assembly for a certain time, but this has not worked out very well because Russians just simply no longer paid their contributions. And so in the end, they came back. So this is a real problem for the Council of Europe, because how can you claim to be an organization to maintain the rule of law and human rights if your member states do the opposite? So, and this has nothing to do with the cooperation. But I think the strategy for the two organizations is to work together on these issues. Say, okay, what can we do to make sure that, because the European Union may have tools that the Council of Europe has not. And so there is a need, I think, to foster more the political cooperation of the two organizations. Also in terms of, and they can do a lot in order to improve the standards of democracy, rule of law, and human rights by cooperating together. They do that with their programs of cooperation, where the Council of Europe implements programs for minority protection, for human rights protection in the member states, for example, in the Caucasian states, who are not the Caucasian states, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, not members of the European Union, for example. Or for Ukraine, for example, non-member states of the European Union. Here they can really still improve and their cooperation. They're already quite good, but they can still improve it. As for human rights, I would prefer Frédéric to answer. But I can also, I mean, what is important is that you have to make sure that the member states in both organizations, European Union as well, respect the founding treaties or the rules or the conventions of their organizations. If you no longer do this, and in the European Union, you have the same kind of hints of non-solidarity, of no longer wanting to cooperate. In the migration crisis, Hungary said, you can decide on quotas of refugees, we're just not going to take any. This is the same, and the European Union could not do anything about it. So, well, they had to go to court, but the Hungarians still have not taken any refugees. So you have to make sure that the member states really respect the rules of the organizations, and this is something that both organizations share. It's in fact trying to make sure that multilateralism still works in our current situation in international relations. That you do not go back to nationalism, and you do not go back to bilateral cooperation. And then they can cooperate. And it's not a problem if the European Union develops an integrated defense policy, because the Council of Europe has no competence in defense. They don't do anything. It's the only field that they are not working in. In other fields, they can cooperate easily. I think it's not a problem, but they have to make sure, they have to maybe discuss together how they can do their ongoing work of monitoring together. And that's the strategy to follow for the future.
Thank you very much, Berthe. Frédéric, as EU law teacher and as someone who has at heart like structure and what the treaty says and what they don't say, and what is maybe foreseeable for the future. What's your take on that?
My first answer would be to realize that what is important for both organizations is to defend the same European values. They have the same European values, and these values, up to a certain point, are in danger in both organizations. And we have seen with the pandemic that that within the member of both organization, there was this idea that it was easier to fight the coronavirus without a democratic approach. For example, we see in both organizations that the role of judges are quite endangered by this idea that in fact they don't really decide what the people want them to decide. And I think that they have these common threats, and we just have to consider that they have, both organizations have their forces and weaknesses. The European Union can develop a much more integrated approach, but the European Union always need also an intergovernmental approach. It's not that both approaches are antagonist. I think that they are highly complementary, because if you take, it depends from the dossier. For certain subjects, intergovernmental approach would be much more efficient. And Birte mentioned the Visegrad countries. It is typical from the kind of pressures that are pushed either by the European Union through the action of the Commission, of the European Parliament, but also the Court of Justice. But we all know that it's at the same time it's efficient because we obtain a certain number of changes, but it's not sufficient as such. And it's also important to give the member states the forum of discussion on a certain number of discussions and subjects. I think that what is wrong nowadays is the idea that you have a sort of a big Europe, which is the Council of Europe, with a more political approach, and you have a sort of smaller Europe, which is the European Union, with an economical approach, which is totally wrong nowadays, because I think that the European Union has a much more political approach than the Council of Europe, and at the same time, the Council of Europe is really the optimal forum of discussion for the question of the rule of law, which is directly linked to the role of judges, but also defending democracy. And we see it quite strongly with the fight against fake news. The Council of Europe has developed a very strong reflection on the subject, and it is something which is used within the European Union in the important discussion that have been opened last December for the Digital Service Act, which is a regulation which will oblige the GAFAM to a certain number of things concerning obligations concerning fake news, and that's why I think that that we need both organizations, but maybe they have to develop a much more strategic political dialogue based on a common approach towards European values, because I think that these values were quite common in the beginning, just after Second World War, but they are not so common nowadays. And if you see how Orban, for example, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is defending his own position, it's difficult to say that it is completely undemocratic. It's difficult to say that it is completely democratic. So I think that we really have to to think about what we have in common and maybe what we want also to develop on the global at the global level. And especially, I think it's important because things are quite different. The problem is Russia, but it's not all. It's Russia in a certain number of dossiers, but it's also China. And the position of the United States. So I think that that these European values are still very specific for Europe, and I think that's that all kind of cooperation between the European Union and the Council of Europe should be based on this common approach of European values. Otherwise, we can always develop very technical kind of relationships, but I think it's of no use for both organizations. And that's right that the European Union is having this quite important reflection on future and how it should be, but I think it's important to recall that this future of the European Union is not without the Council of Europe, and that's also something we will have to remember.
Yeah, and I think that's a great not conclusion, because of course you can ask your question, and I'll give the floor to the people who ask the floor, but. I think it's really interesting, especially in this context of this specific event on global Europe and how we make Europe a global player. And then maybe we often think about Europe as a global player being only the European Union, whereas thinking about it like both ways and working together to sort of promote the values that are at the core of both organizations is actually what could make this continent stronger on an international scene and regarding other actors that might be less tacky on how important those values are, so to say. Thank you very much for answering my questions. Now I will give the floor to the participants for more questions. So I had Angelo, who had the first questions for a while, and then I'll give the floor to Domenico Moro. Angelo, if you want to take the floor, I think you have been allowed to speak now. If you can turn on your microphone. Okay, then Domenico, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I have two questions for the speakers. In the first one, in 2019, the French President Macron, in a speech to French ambassadors and also to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, spoke about the need to build a European security architecture that includes Russia. What do you think of this proposal? The second question is, given that the Council of Europe's competencies include the protection of human rights and the rule of law, can it be the institutional framework within which to develop a common market with Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions to ask before I give the floor to our speakers to answer this first set of questions? I see no further questions now, so maybe you can start with answering those two. Maybe Frédéric, you want to take the floor first, and then Birte, or
Birte, if you maybe the first one.
No, that's fine, Frédéric. Go ahead.
Okay, then I'll give the floor to Frédéric, and you can maybe answer the second one, and then Berthe can answer the first one as you wish.
I can answer if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It just you have to. Yeah, now it's better. Well, for the I think the speech, if it was done before the Parliamentary Assembly, it must have it was probably pronounced in the objective of maybe even appeasing Russia, I would say, because the Russian European the relationship between the European Union and Russia has not improved. It has even deteriorated in recent times, and I think Russia is for Europe in general. There is a big question mark. How do we deal with Russia, not only for defense issues, but in general? Because when Russia was joined the Council of Europe in 1995, there was a clear willingness of Russia to become part of the European family. And there was also, I mean, this was also translated in a partnership with NATO, which was, there's an Eastern specific partnership, Russia-NATO, which was also later on concluded, which of course no longer works well at all, because Russia in recent times, and I would say especially after the Ukrainian crisis, which was quite kind of a moment of where the a break of the relations between the European Union and Russia, it has developed a different policy, which is less linked to the European organizations, including the Council of Europe, but especially the European Union, and more on the way of becoming again a world power, a global player on their own. And so when Macron talks about a security partnership with Russia, then he probably, because in 2019 is also beginning of the new European Commission, and they have announced that the European Union want to develop their own defense, European defense more and independently also from or maybe not independently, but more integrated with in NATO, and more independent from the United States, because as long as Trump was in power, it was difficult. The relation between the European Union and the United States was also difficult. And so this was probably a gesture towards Russia, saying, look, we are going to develop our defense policy, but we would like to do this, of course, in cooperation with Russia. Because, I mean, Russia, it's not like for the United States. Russia is our neighbor, and the Poles are certainly very interested in having a peaceful relationship with Russia, and also Ukraine, of course. And so I think this was done in the purpose of looking for a partnership with Russia, but not, of course, including them in a common defense policy. That would be, in my opinion, impossible. As for the common market, I think one of the clear divisions of work between the Council of Europe and the European Community, but as from 1957 on, when the common market was created, was to say, okay, from that moment onwards, there was always this willingness to say, okay, we Council of Europe, we are not so much going to work in economic issues. This is more for the European Community, and later on for the European Union with a single market. So there is a little bit of a division of work. So a common market within the Council of Europe between, I'm very hesitant. I don't really think it's going to materialize. But what I can more see is that, of course, there is a big need to have an economic partnership between Russia and the European Union. A common market, I don't know, but certainly with regard to the energy policy, then there needs to be a clear partnership, because there's a big dependency of the European Union in terms of gas and energy provision. And so there is a need to cooperate with Russia for economic issues, but I think this will be more the European Union dealing with this rather than the Council of Europe is probably not going to engage into the setting up of a customs union with Russia. I hope I have answered well your two questions, and maybe Frederick would like to add something.
Thank you, Bit. What I would say that first, it's difficult. It's always difficult for me to see why they distinguishes at that time when they ratify the European Union, this idea that you have a clear distinction between economy and human rights is nonsense. It was politically interesting at that time because the member states, they have ratified the European Convention on Human Rights, and it was more than enough, I think, for them at that time. And when they decided to enter into the European Union, they simply did not want to give the competence on the protection of human rights to the European Union. Because they had already done the, if I may say so, the European Court of Justice. At that time, it's also very clear that the European Court of Justice was not powerful at all. And they had to build their own legitimacy into the system. But I think that for the member states, human rights was simply a national question. What is different today is that we have seen that it's impossible to distinguish, because one of the first human rights which has been developed from an historical point of view is the right to droit de propriété. I don't even know how to say it in English. Ownership right. And it's, of course, it's this right which has been also defended by the European Court of Justice within the European Union since the very beginning of the 1970s. So it's difficult for me to say that there is a clear distinction from this point of view between the Court of Justice and the European Union. And the idea to develop a common market between, in the ambit of the Council of Europe is, for me, just impossible from a legal point of view, because internal market, it's a question of integration. So if you enter into a common market, then it means that you accept more integration. And that's something we have experienced very clearly between Turkey and the European Union. We have a customs union, and it's we see that it is there is a clear political will behind it, and since we have this customs union, then we see that it's much more difficult to go in a deeper cooperation between the European Union and Turkey, because in fact Turkey does not accept this kind of process anymore. And I think it is the same with Russia. Russia is not interested into a more integrated approach. So I don't think that the common market is the idea, but a stronger cooperation, of course, is important. And a stronger cooperation is not just a political dialogue, is not just about human rights. It's also about a certain number of economic principles. And I think also that we see it quite clearly within the ambit of the Council of Europe on some policies developed by the Council of Europe. There is this sort of cooperation or partnership, joint programs, which change quite a lot of things, even from the economical point of view. So I think that it's in this deeper cooperation that we can go, but I don't think that common markets would be the good approach. In 2018, I think that the idea also was, how is it possible to get Russia back into the Council of Europe? Because we had this budgetary problem. My question is why the Council of Europe accepted Russia to be one of the grands contributeurs. Because of course, if you pay a lot and then you decide you have a problem to accept a certain number of rules, then you decide not to pay. And then I just remember that for the Council of Europe, it was a complete blockage at that time, and that we had to find a solution. So we also have at the Council of Europe, maybe we also have to choose our financial dependencies.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for this very clear set of answers. I have seen that Hugh, you had a question, so I don't know if you want to turn your mic on and ask a question. Maybe that would be more.
It's in the chat.
Yeah, it's in the chat as well.
It's in the chat.
Please, Eva, just the mic.
Right. Okay.
Okay, I did. Oh,
Right.
was it Eva or Hugo? I don't know.
Hugh.
Eva and you.
Yeah, it was just as I said. It was about the. My question was about the ESIC conference last year. There was a question, a forum on integration of people who were sympathetic towards the EU. Either regaining citizenship if they were once EU citizens, as in the case of Brexit, or whether they wanted to be EU citizens from other contexts such as the Western Balkans and so on, and they had a connection with Europe in that way. Is there going to be any regulation of the flow of citizens between these, Council of Europe countries, on the wider Europe and the European Union? Is there going to be a specific regulation of those citizens that we can regain our citizenship in some way and earn it back from the society, from our own society, and from a European perspective? Because I'm very idealistic personally about Europe, and I do, although I'm no longer a European citizen now, I would like to be by the end of my life. And is there any hope of ever being a European citizen by the end of my life again?
Right, thank you. Eva?
Okay, do you hear me? Because now it's a little bit difficult to hear everything clearly. But first of all, let me thank you for this very interesting historical perspective also, because I think this is very important to communicate. It is not present in the mind of actual politicians and people interested in politics. So some people wonder why this whole aspect of human rights is not so present in the European Union, or like it is seen something. It is in our discussions in the parliament, it was always present, but of course in decision making, that's another a pair of shoes. So this sharing of of focuses, one on economical issues and one on human rights, can be helpful if there is cooperation. And this is why I think it has to be enforced very much, because it is very nice if we have this human rights aspect also under the participation of our neighboring countries. This is very, very important for us. But if there are breaches in human rights, what consequences would it have? So you see it, and you illustrate it also on the example of Russia. This is one of the most critical points, and especially also for Turkey. If you see the way that Turkey has taken within the last years, you really can mirror it also in their behavior in the council. So I think a stronger cooperation would be good, because especially economic sanctions often, even if it's not so perceived in the public, has a result on human rights issues. I saw it on the example, for example, in Mexico. I was part of the Mexican delegation when I was in the European Parliament. So there is a response to it, but only if there is also a consequence if someone is continuing having breaches in human rights. So where do you see the specific mechanisms how we could enhance the dialogue between the European Union and the Council of Europe? Because I found it always very inspiring to follow their debates, but I was one of the few ones that tried to bridge the gaps here. So I would be interested if you have some ideas about possible new ways of communication that would enhance the connection between human rights and economy, because this is connected in reality. Look at the whole problems of value chains and international trade. So what would be your ideas on that?
Thank you, Eva. I've seen that Michelle also has a question, and then I suggest we close the round of questions here, because we need to leave room for our speakers to answer your questions. So Michelle, if you want to activate your microphone and ask your question directly, and then I'll give the floor to who wants to start.
Okay, no,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, then that's it. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Ophelia, and thank you for the organizers of this event. It's very interesting. I understand that both organizations, the European Union and the Council of Europe, they have been created to promote and to defend democracy. We know that the situation is very difficult now with illiberal democracies, Russia, Turkey, but even inside the European Union, we have Hungary or Poland. Of course, I know because I was the negotiator for the European Commission for the Memorandum of Understanding. Yeah, I know we have this document. Yeah, it's important, but it's more for legal matters. So my question is very simple. Who can be the most efficient to defend democracy in 2020? European Union and Council of Europe, on how to improve, how to reinforce the relations between both organizations to tackle this very important problem we have for the near future.
Thank you very much. Birte, then I'll give you the floor. You answer in all the questions that you feel like you have to answer, and then I'll give the floor to Frederica to do the same.
I thought these were really all very important and interesting comments and questions that were just pronounced. For Hugh, I'm very touched. I mean, this is often happening now with, I have all these British students who come into the classes on European integration who say, we still feel European, we would like to be part of Europe, and we did not agree with Brexit. So this is really traumatizing for a big part of, I mean, you mustn't forget that only almost just over 50% did not want to stay in the European Union. But your comment made me think about a project on European integration, which was put forward in 1920 after the First World War by a Danish elite thinker, Herford. And he was envisaging a Europe on the form of a European citizenship. And anybody who felt European could be part of that Europe. It was kind of an idealist project. And even people all over the world, if they felt European, they could be part of this Europe. Now, the problem is that if you link citizenship to a state, then the state, and especially in our Westphalian terms, needs a territory, and the territory of the European Union is the territory of the sum of the member states. And if you grant certain rights to the citizens, the right to vote, for example, in the European Parliament, or the European passport, or the rights that have been integrated in the European treaties. Frederic knows it better than I do in detail, but these rights, you cannot easily give them to other members outside. But I do think that in the deal that has been concluded with the United Kingdom, there have been arrangements for those UK citizens living in the European Union to make sure that they they are not deprived of all their rights because now there is the Brexit. But these are more exceptional rules due to the Brexit. But I think what your comment is also linked to an idea of European identity, and the Council of Europe precisely is the organization that was founded in terms of we are a European family. And so this doesn't give you rights, but it's more in terms of who do I belong to? And the Russians and the Turks are also part of the Council of Europe, and say the idea was to make them also feel kind of part of this European family. And then how can we translate this into maybe concrete facilities for the citizens? Is that, for example, via exchange programs, via arrangement for visas, which we do have between the European Union and outside member states, Turkey, for example, or also in Eastern Europe at the eastern borders of the European Union, and also if you look, for example, in the Council of Europe, you have the youth center, and they organize exchanges between all member states of the Council. So there is maybe a possibility to foster this, and after the Brexit, to create even more facilities, so that the outside, those who are not part of the European Union but part of Europe, have some sort of exchanges and cooperation. I don't know how concretely you can put this into practice. It's quite difficult because also a lot of legal aspects, but it's an excellent idea, because we also have to deal all with a lot of Euroscepticism, and it's not the right to vote which would bring you back forcibly to become pro-European. And so, it's, if we look away from the rights and more for the idea of belonging to Europe, then I'm sure that we can do something about this. The question of Eva on how can we enforce human rights? This is a question where I've been also trying to think about all this time when studying the Council of Europe, and the way how the Council of Europe tried to make sure that human rights were not only respected on paper, but actually in reality, which is the monitoring procedures that they have for the court. The court is the monitoring procedure for human rights, but you also have this for minority rights. For example, there's a Charter on Protection of Minorities. You have a lot of monitoring mechanisms, which I feel are not always very efficient, because they are not economic sanctions. Because you were talking about economic sanctions. If the Council of Europe had the possibility to say, okay, look, you have subscribed to the Minority Convention, but you are not respecting your minorities in your country. So here, if you don't do that by that time, then if you don't do anything about it, you have to pay a fine, and you pay the fine to the Council of Europe. That would be, I'm sure, much more efficient. And to make this, put this into reality, I don't know how you would do it, but it is a brilliant idea, because the money always works. But I think there is another possibility to work on human rights, because in the end, human rights I always like this idea of the Council of Europe as a school for democracy or human rights protection. And you can say that because what is important in the Council of Europe, you have these difficult states for the moment. You have them inside. You have the Turks there. You have the Russians there. You have you can make them discuss in the Parliamentary Assembly. You have been part of the European Parliament, so I think dialogue and discussion is important. And so it maybe doesn't change something right away, but these people bring these ideas. If you discuss and if you try and make them adhere to the principles of the Council of Europe inside European Parliament, they have joint conferences between the European Parliament and Council of Europe, for example, that you from inside you try to influence their moral principles and then bring them back into Russia or Hungary or Poland. Because why does Poland and Hungary have changes in the constitution which go more to authoritarian regimes? It's not only the political leaders. I mean, there is something wrong in the collective society about these, which makes them change, and so you have to. So I think this is a kind of a long-term educational, pedagogical, and political work which is important, and which is in fact the contrary to the sanctions, but which also I think works, and is maybe even it's the stick and the carrot, and it may I'm not sure what always works better, but I think you kind of need both. And the last question, I mean, who is going to protect better democracy? That's an excellent question. It's very clear and very direct. Well, the Council of Europe would immediately say, this is our work, because if you look at the division of work, I mean, they are the ones who have always put forward that they wanted to work for democracy. And you can see it. I mean, they have conferences on how to interpret democracy, because democracy is not always seen the same way. At the beginning, it was simply a national parliamentary democracy, but progressively, the Council of Europe has also taken in the idea that you need a local and regional democracy. It's also important to have a mayor and to have an elected region, and that you have a kind of multi-level democracy working. And we have the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities in the Council of Europe, and they also do monitoring. They survey elections, and so to make sure that democracy is respected. And I think this is a work that you can leave to the Council of Europe. I know it's not perfect, because we have the OSCE who's also doing these missions, and we also have the EU who's doing these missions. We need further coordination. I think that this coordination can be very well done by the Council of Europe, because to interpret or to see what are the needs for democracy, for example, electronic voting, this is also a topic. That's there are a lot of groups working in the Council of Europe is good in these innovative tools. They always are the first ones to do a convention against cybercrime, for example. But why not work on how to implement electronic voting without threat of being, of phishing or of corruption? This is a kind of where I think the European Union, the Council of Europe, it's not who does it better, but it's maybe one, in my opinion, one of the fields where the European Union could leave a lot of work for the Council of Europe. As for the European Union, if you want to increase democracy inside the European Union, but of course you know this, then you have to increase the competence of the European Parliament. They have already a lot, but you can still progress on that. And if you want to make our European Union a federation once, you still have to work on more competences for the European Parliament.
Very nice words to conclude your intervention, Berta. Frédéric, please.
What I find interesting in the question is that all the questions are in fact linked with the question of efficiency. And it's a central question for the European Union and for the Council of Europe. We all know that for the Council of Europe, one of the basic problems is that they have more than 220 conventions, but they don't all work. So we really have to find on the ratification, signatory ratification, and then application of the convention. The monitoring system is one of the key points, according to me, for Council of Europe. It can be more effective, and I think it's something which is important. Concerning the European Union, sometimes I would say that the idea that the European Union has a more efficient law is not exact. So we also have to work on the correct application within the member states. And I think it's really one of the most important problems for the European Union. It's not to decide. They had the legislative procedure, it works, it's quite, even in case of urgency, it's quite efficient. The problem is we have to find the necessary tools to link the European Union and the member states, because the real government of Europe is not the Commission at all. I don't know why we always say the Commission, it is the member states, well, the government of the European Union. And that's why we get into trouble for certain subjects, because we know that we have problems of effective application. And this is linked to the question of how is it possible to have a more strengthened cooperation between both organizations. Of course, we had the accession to the European Convention, and I think that I've more or less answer the question. We have what I call the informal connection between the two organizations, and we can see it through the case law. My question is the legislative procedure. I remember that I was working with the European Parliament on the whistleblower directive, for example, because there was quite a big problem of competences to solve. And I was quite surprised during the auditions before the European Parliament, because I asked the question, but did you work with the Council of Europe on this specific question? Because the Council of Europe had worked on it, and it was a failure because it was impossible to sign a convention. And I was quite surprised to see that, in fact, they simply did not know what was going on in the Council of Europe. So I think that one of the means to strengthen the cooperation is maybe to reinforce the information exchange between both organizations. We have the necessary structures to do so, but maybe it could be used a little bit more. And I think that to strengthen the cooperation, this idea that the European Union is signing a certain number of conventions of the Council of Europe is a very important one. We see that it's quite efficient in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, but maybe it has to be developed, of course, in the field of competences of the European Union. So I think that's also something which is important. And it is linked to the very last question, what is the organization which is the more efficient for the defense of democracy? I would say that it's the Council of Europe, because the level of expertise of the Council of Europe is much more developed. But when, for example, we take the example of fake news, because I think that democracy is really endangered by this kind of phenomenon much more than anything else. And if you just see what is going on this weekend in France with the regional and departmental election, it's just completely clear. Fake news is really a problem. And I think that the European Union is much more efficient to regulate the platform and to have an innovative regulation of platforms than the Council of Europe. So that's why I'm very convinced by this double track approach, and not to try to have a clear division of competencies between both organizations, because I think that it's not efficient, and up to a certain point it's complete nonsense to believe that you will have, you know, sort of big Europe and smaller Europe with very clear division of competences. I don't think that's a good idea.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for the last questions. Now, Angelo, I see you still have your hand up and you didn't have the chance to ask your question earlier. So like in 1 minute, because we're running a bit late, maybe you can ask the last question before we round it up.
Yeah, I hope you're well. Thank you. It's about the complementarity that was evoked by the participants. Don't you think that one of the complementarities, one that was not mentioned, is that of the possibility for the Council of Europe to, in many conventions, to have an almost global outreach, which the European Union cannot join directly, but can profit from it if it is cooperating with the Council of Europe in the similar sectors, and they are developing similar activities. Concretely, I speak about, it was evoked about the data, protection of data, for instance. Now that they are close, as you said, as you know, the Council of Europe is the only one who can enlarge it further, because there's no limit in the candidate countries. There's also the cybercrime, also the convention of that exists. There is also in bioethics, because it has no limit or they cannot be efficient if it is not global, more or less. And there is also the very interesting thing about there's also the constitutions, the Venice Commission, where even the US are members. the US are member. For instance, the Council of Europe could theoretically check the latest elections in the US and try to find out how things were or should be, or how should in the future do better. And there are other probably areas. And recently there was the representative of the European Union Commission in Strasbourg, which exists, as you know, for in a permanent way, who had really said that the European Union wants to use this possibility for the Council of Europe to try to have a global outreach or a quasi-global outreach instead of substitutes. How do you feel about that?
Thank you very much. Is there any comments from our two speakers to this comment or reaction?
I would say
that's right. That we have in fact a lot of common. I would say I was about to say we have more or less everything in common between the European Union and the Council of Europe. My concern is that if I'm much more specialized in the EU law, but my concern with the EU is that I think that the EU does not really take the Council of Europe into consideration, if I may say so, when it comes to the legislative procedure. And I think that the European Union maybe has to progress in this idea that it is for the Council of Europe to really establish the basic standards for human rights protection, rule of law, or democracy, and that the European Union has to build on this basis. I think it's for the Council of Europe, the ambition is a bit different. I think that the Council of Europe should really specialize on these three fields where the Council of Europe has a clear expertise. And I think the Council of Europe is also the good forum for the discussion on societal problems, because it's much easier to do it in an intergovernmental approach than in an integration approach. And that's why for many examples, we can see that the European Union, in fact, is based on ideas which has been developed within the ambit of the Council of Europe, but does not always say it. And sometimes the Council of Europe does not really know how to push a certain number of debates, because I think that it's concerning democracy, especially, it's easier for the Council of Europe to develop this kind of basic fundamental standards.
If I might just add that I completely agree with Angelo, because I think he has put a real good point forward. I have always said that the Council of Europe's advantage is that that it has a lot of flexible tools. And one of the flexible tools is that the conventions are not open only for the European Union, they are open for outside member states, and they can be all around the world, not for all conventions, but, and so this is, it's true in that sense, they can be they have a global outreach, and it's almost like a soft power, a normative power, which can reach out into the world. You can also see that with the Commission of Venice, which is a very interesting tool and which has started to its work for the future candidates of the Council of Europe, but now is working for any country in the world, African countries who want to improve their constitutions. So I think it's one of the advantages of the tools of the Council, and I think that Angelo is right about this, and I think that the European Union has also recognized the importance of these open tools. And by the way, or other organizations, the United Nations, for example, has also recognized because the United Nations are a global organization, a world organization, but they also are very interested in these open tools of the Council of Europe, because sometimes they can be used in the United Nations framework also as a model, or maybe even as a tool. I do also agree, however, with Frédéric, is that in reality, the Council of Europe, unfortunately, does not, for the European Union, represent a very interesting, important organizations, apart from maybe the Human Rights Court. And this is it's a pity, because they should pay more attention to the Council of Europe. In my opinion, it would be beneficial for both organizations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our two speakers for a very, very, very interesting discussion. Thank you to you participants for the interesting questions that allow us to dive a bit deeper into the subject. I want to remind you to fill the form on how satisfied you were with this session. The form that Hervé will put back, or has put back already in the chat. Thank you very much for being with us. Yeah, really from like the bottom of our hearts to our two speakers for taking the time to be there this morning and to have such a vivid conversation on a topic that is both interesting but complex. I invite you to come back at 2 for our next session. After law and history, we're diving a bit more into economics this afternoon for the first session, before we have our session on the Conference of Europe and what actually happened this morning. And before we close with a more political perspective with Nathalie Loiseau as member of the European Parliament. So still quite a big program to follow this afternoon. Hope to see you there. So meeting here at 2. And thank you very much to everyone for the participation.